On a cold Christmas Eve night in 1945, a house fire tore through the Sodder family home in West Virginia. 5 children vanished without a trace. No bodies, no remains, no answers. What started as a tragic fire quickly spiraled into one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. For decades, the case of the missing Sodder children has puzzled investigators, fueled conspiracy theories, and left a family searching for truth in the ashes. Were the children really lost in the fire? Or did something far more sinister happen that night? Now, after 80 years, shocking new evidence has come to light. The mystery may finally be solved, but the truth is far darker than anyone imagined. What really happened to the Sodder children, and why was it hidden for so long? Let's find out. It was just past midnight on Christmas Eve, 1945. The Sodder family was asleep in their 2-story home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The tree was up, gifts were wrapped, and the younger kids had just been told they could stay up late. After all, it was the holidays. But by morning, the house was in ashes, and 5 of the 10 Sodder children were gone. The fire spread fast, too fast. It tore through the wooden home in under 45 minutes. Jenny Sodder, the mother, woke up to the smell of smoke and rushed to grab her youngest child. George, the father, escaped with 4 kids, but the others? They were never seen again. Not burned, not buried, not found, just vanished. But here's the part that stuns fire experts to this day. Even in the most extreme house fires, partial remains survive. But when investigators searched through the ashes, they didn't find a single tooth, not a scrap, nothing. Forensic scientists would later confirm there should have been something left, anything. The official story? The 5 missing children died in the blaze. But how could that be when their beds were empty, the remains missing, and the fire department didn't even arrive until 7 hours after the flames were gone? But that was just the beginning. The fire was shocking, but what's truly chilling is what happened before it. Long before the flames consumed the Sodder home, something was off. People had come around. Some were friendly. Others were unsettling. Each encounter left behind a strange feeling, like puzzle pieces scattered around the house, but nobody saw the full picture. Not yet. It began innocently enough. A man walked up to the Sodder home one afternoon. He said he was looking for work. George Sodder, who owned a successful coal trucking business, was used to people asking for a job. He was known for helping folks out. The man made small talk, glanced at the house, and then his eyes landed on the fuse box. Without prompting, he muttered something bizarre. That fuse box, that's gonna cause a fire one day. George was confused. He had just upgraded the house's electrical system. Everything had been inspected and approved. There was no reason to think a fire was remotely possible. The man didn't say much else, just walked off. George shook his head and went back inside, brushing it off as strange but harmless. But that wasn't the last strange interaction. Soon after, another man came by, claiming to be an insurance agent. George declined the offer, not interested in any new policies. What should have been a quick goodbye turned tense. The man's voice changed. He grew hostile. According to George, the man leaned in and warned him that his house would go up in flames and his children would be destroyed. George was stunned, but the man left quickly and disappeared without giving a name. Who threatens an entire family over insurance? The threats didn't come out of nowhere. George was no stranger to controversy. He was born Giorgio Sodder in Italy, but after immigrating to the US, he dropped his Italian roots and his loyalty to Italy's government. He hated Mussolini, called him a fraud, a criminal, a disgrace to the country, and he didn't say it quietly. George openly spoke out against Mussolini in a town full of Italian immigrants, many of whom still supported the regime. Some admired his bravery, others were furious. Fights broke out. People stopped talking to him. The tension in Fayetteville began to thicken. Still, George wasn't the type of person to back down. His business thrived. His kids went to school, and the Sodders were seen as a proud, hard-working family. But then came the call, and nothing about it felt like coincidence. It was around 12:30 a.m. on Christmas Eve. Everyone in the house was asleep, except Jenny, the mother. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet. She got up and answered. A woman's voice greeted her. But instead of wishing her a Merry Christmas, the woman asked for someone Jenny had never heard of. In the background, Jenny could hear what sounded like laughter, glasses clinking, almost like a party. When she told the caller they had the wrong number, the woman chuckled again, then abruptly hung up. It was strange, but not enough to set off alarms until later when investigators traced the call. It came from a payphone, not across the country, not in another town, less than 2 miles from the Sodder home. It starts to look like someone had a plan. George and Jenny didn't know it yet, but their family wasn't just the victim of a house fire. Something else had begun moving around them, quietly, precisely. And what came next would only raise more questions and bury the answers deeper. As the Sodder home lit up like a bonfire in the cold, early hours of Christmas morning, chaos exploded inside. Jenny Sodder, already rattled from the strange phone call minutes earlier, jolted awake to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling wood. She ran to gather the youngest children. George sprang from bed, calling out names, but flames were already spilling through the hallway like liquid fire. The clock was ticking, but this wasn't just a desperate rush to escape, it was something more sinister. The second floor was already choked with smoke. That's where Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were sleeping. The stairs were impassable. Flames were swallowing the upper floor. Jenny tried to call the fire department. No operator, no connection. The phone was dead. For a moment, she assumed the fire had melted the line. But when investigators examined it later, they discovered the line hadn't burned at all. And just when it seemed like nothing else could go wrong, the fire department failed them too. The station was only 2.5 miles away. A normal response should have taken minutes, but they didn't arrive until nearly 8 hours later. By then, the house had collapsed into a skeleton of itself. The smoke was gone, the heat had faded, and so had any hope of rescue. But the worst part? The nightmare was far from over, because when the investigators finally did search the ashes, what they claimed to find only made things even stranger. After the fire burned their home to the ground, the Sodders expected answers. Instead, they got a silence so loud it echoed for decades. Chief F.J. Morris, the man in charge, looked at the smoking rubble and told George and Jenny that the fire was just a tragic accident. No real investigation, no official search team. Within hours, they declared the 5 missing children dead. The cause of death was listed as fire, even though not one body had been recovered. The case was already being closed. But then, something even stranger happened. Something that would push the family from disbelief into full-blown fury. In 1946, over a year after the fire, Chief Morris suddenly showed up with a pizza box adi pulao. Inside, he claimed, were the ashes recovered from the ruins of the Sodder home. He handed the box to a local minister, asking him to bury it near the scene of the fire. Quietly. He didn't explain why it had taken him a year to come forward. He didn't say why he hadn't reported the find sooner. Just a vague statement that it had been overlooked and that perhaps it would bring the family some closure. But George and Jenny weren't ready to let go, because while officials were busy shutting down the case, something else was starting to emerge. Sightings, whispers, people claiming to have seen the children alive, and some of those stories were too specific to ignore. The fire was supposed to be the end. 5 children gone. No bodies, no goodbyes, and no answers. Authorities called it a tragic accident and moved on. But George and Jenny Sodder couldn't move on, because the deeper they looked, the more disturbing things became. The first account came almost immediately. A woman driving along Route 16 near the Sodder house during the early hours of the fire said she saw something strange. A car parked on the side of the road, facing away from the house. Inside, she said, were children watching the fire through the rear window. She said they looked stunned, not screaming, just watching, quietly. She didn't recognize them at the time, but when the faces of the Sodder children were printed in the papers, she was sure. She said it again and again. I saw those kids. Her statement was never taken seriously by police. They brushed it off as confusion, a misidentification. But more sightings followed, and they were harder to ignore. In Charleston, West Virginia, about 50 miles from Fayetteville, a woman working the front desk at a hotel claimed to have seen 4 of the Sodder children enter the lobby just days after the fire. According to her, they were accompanied by 2 adults, both with Italian accents. The kids didn't speak, They looked scared. One sat with his head down, another clung to the woman's coat sleeve. When the hotel worker tried to interact, one of the adults gave her a sharp look, stern, quiet, intimidating. She didn't push. Later, when she saw the missing children's photos in the newspaper, her blood ran cold. She contacted the family, convinced she had seen them. Her timeline matched. Her descriptions were accurate, but by the time anyone looked into it, the people were long gone. No names, no check-in record. George and Jenny began to receive letters, some anonymous, others signed, with wild claims that the children had been taken, that they were alive, but forbidden to contact their family. One letter even claimed the kids had been adopted by another family out west and given new identities. Jenny kept everyone. She didn't know what was true, but someone out there knew something. By now, George and Jenny knew they weren't just grieving. They were being ignored, shut down, lied to. The town had moved on, but the Sodders hadn't, and they never would. They wanted the world to see what happened. So they did something bold, something no one in Fayetteville could avoid. By the late 1950s, George and Jenny Sodder had stopped trusting officials, reporters, even neighbors. The fire hadn't taken their children, not completely, not in their minds. And every dead-end lead, every false promise, every shrug from a detective only made one thing clear. If they wanted answers, they'd have to force people to pay attention. That's when George decided to build it, a towering, hand-painted timber billboard anchored into the soil on the side of US Route 16 just outside Fayetteville. This wasn't just a sign, it was a weapon, a roadside monument to a mystery the world had tried to bury. The children stared down from the billboard. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, frozen in time, faces full of life, faces the authorities had long written off, but here they were, now impossible to ignore. The sign worked. It did what the police, the papers, and the fire department never could. It made people care. Leads started pouring in from all over the country. One woman claimed to see Betty at a convent in St. Louis. A man said he spoke to a young drifter in Manhattan who looked exactly like Maurice. A tip came from Florida about a family who had suddenly adopted 5 children. No papers, no background, no questions asked. Each tip was different. But all of them had one thing in common. They came from strangers who saw that sign and realized this wasn't just some family tragedy. George didn't let a single tip go unexplored. He traveled across states, tracking rumors. He knocked on doors, visited hospitals and schools. The truth was still buried. But one theory, the one the Sodders feared most, was beginning to gather momentum. It involved power, silence, and the possibility that this was never about a fire, but about a message. For George and Jenny Sodder, the horror didn't end with the fire. It began with it, because as more facts were uncovered and more leads were ignored, a sickening thought took hold. It crept in slowly, like smoke under a door. What if this wasn't just a tragedy? What if this was a warning? The deeper George looked, the more he became convinced this wasn't just an accident. This was political, personal, targeted. George's anti-Mussolini stance had made enemies in Fayetteville. But what if those enemies didn't just gossip? What if they wanted to make an example of him? What better way than to destroy what he loved most, and then convince him the truth would never be found? The theory grew when researchers began to look at other unsolved cases from the era. Patterns emerged. Children disappearing with no trace, authorities turning a blind eye, investigations closed with absurd conclusions, rumors of quiet pressure from behind the scenes. Suddenly, George's story didn't feel isolated. It felt intentional, a cover-up in plain sight. That George's public grief, his billboard, his search was being watched, and that any move to get closer to the truth might put the remaining family in danger. George started to believe it. So did Jenny. Not because they were desperate, but because every logical explanation had been stripped away, leaving only the uncomfortable ones. There were whispers of organized groups. Jenny, meanwhile, never gave up hope, but hope for her was no longer joyful, it was heavy. She believed her children were alive, but she also believed they might never be allowed to come home. And if someone truly wanted this case buried, then there was only one hope left: find the proof they didn't expect, something physical and not buried in paperwork or rumors, but in the earth itself. And decades later, modern researchers would return to where it all began. With new technology, fresh eyes, and one haunting question: was something still hidden beneath the ashes? For nearly half a century, the spot where the Sodder home once stood remained still. No more smoke, no more flames, just overgrown weeds and the echoes of a tragedy too painful to name. After George and Jenny died, George in 1969, Jenny in 1989, the case quieted. The billboard was finally taken down. The mystery, it seemed, had been swallowed by time. But time doesn't erase the truth. In the early 2000s, long after official investigations had stopped, a group of independent researchers picked up the trail. These weren't just amateur sleuths. They were forensic scientists, fire behavior experts, radar technicians, even retired law enforcement officers, people who had seen enough in their careers to know when something didn't add up. Modern fire experts were clear. A house fire, even one fueled by wood, furniture, and insulation, typically burns at around 1,100 to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's enough to scorch a structure, enough to blacken steel. Yet the Sodder children left behind nothing? It made no sense, and it never had. The researchers turned their attention to the scene itself. The house had long since been removed, but the ground, the soil, still held memory. They surveyed the entire foundation, corner to corner, and what they found changed everything. Other parts of the scan revealed unusual soil disturbances, places where the ground had clearly been dug up, disturbed, and refilled. In particular, one area had the shape of a box or a container buried deep under layers of ash and dirt. They extracted core soil samples and sent them to a lab for testing. The results? Unsettling. The soil tested positive for traces of calcium phosphate, a mineral compound found in human bones. It wasn't enough to identify specific individuals, but it confirmed that human material had once been there. And that raised a terrifying possibility. Someone had returned to the fire site before investigators did, to dig, to remove, to bury, or to hide. Even more disturbing, the anomalies were found nowhere near the spots where the children were believed to have been sleeping. Not under the bedroom, not by the staircase, not in the living room. So if they died in the fire, why were their remains not under the places where they would have perished? And if those bones weren't theirs, who buried them? And why? The radar scans, lab results, and modern fire forensics all pointed to one thing. The official story was impossible. George and Jenny had said it from the start, and now, with science behind them, their belief was vindicated. The children didn't die in that fire. So where did they go? Researchers started to theorize. Could the children have been abducted before the fire started? Could they have been drugged or lured out by someone they knew? Were they taken and kept silent under threat? One chilling possibility was raised, a theory that the children were separated and adopted out under false identities, that they had been placed in homes across different states, their memories suppressed or altered, their names changed. It had happened before, during wartime, during social experiments, even in covert government operations. Could this have been one of them? What made the mystery even darker was the fact that many of the key files from the original investigation, notes, reports, photographs, had either been lost, destroyed, or sealed. No one could explain why. Some believed they were misplaced. Others believed they were intentionally removed. The researchers presented their findings to state officials, hoping for a modern reinvestigation. But the response was the same as it had been for decades. Polite interest, followed by cold silence. No action, no reopening of the case, no movement. Just the same haunting questions and a deeper void where answers should have been. But in that void, one thing had changed. The world now knew that the Sodders had been right to question everything. And if bones could lie hidden for 60 years, what else had been buried? And that leaves one final mystery still burning at the heart of this case. If they didn't die in the fire, who took the Sodder children and why? The facts, the photos, and the findings, none of it mattered more than the question that haunted the Sodder family every single day for the rest of their lives. If the children were alive, why didn't they come home? It's the one theory that hurt more than the rest. The fire, the sabotage, the cover-up, all horrifying, but nothing hurt worse than the silence. If the Sodder children had truly survived the fire, if they'd been taken, hidden, raised under new names, then why, after 10 years, 20, 30, why didn't they reach out? The billboard stood for 40 years, staring down traffic like a public prayer. Their names were known across the country. Newspapers, radio, even early television broadcasts ran their photos. Anyone with access to the outside world could have seen it. And still, no one came. The photo of Louis, mailed anonymously in 1967, was the only thread that ever reached them. It had no return address, just a strange message written on the back and the haunting possibility that he was trying to say, "I'm here, but I can't come home." And that's what made this theory so chilling. Not just that the children lived, but that someone had kept them away. Psychologists and trauma experts who reviewed the case years later proposed chilling explanations. If the children were abducted as part of a coordinated act, especially one that spanned multiple adults, perhaps even organizations, they may have been told that the only way to survive was to forget who they were. It's happened before, in cults, wartime separations, trafficking cases, and covert operations. Children as young as 5, taken from their homes, can have their identities rewritten within months. Names changed, locations changed. The mind learns to adapt, to survive, to believe what it's told. If that happened to the Sodder children, then by the time they were old enough to ask questions, they might not have remembered who to ask. Or maybe it wasn't just psychological, maybe it was fear. What if their abductors told them the truth, but threatened them into silence? What if they were told their siblings would be hurt if they tried to escape, that their return would bring violence, not reunion? It's not just a theory. It's the same psychological manipulation seen in real historical cases, where victims were kept in line not with chains, but with fear. That kind of fear doesn't fade. It hardens. It becomes survival instinct, and it can last a lifetime. Another theory is even more heartbreaking. What if they tried to return and failed? What if someone stepped in to stop them? What if the people behind their disappearance watched the Sodders just as closely? What if that 1967 photo wasn't just a breadcrumb, it was a cry for help that got intercepted? By the time Jenny passed in 1989, the trail was cold. Most of the original witnesses were gone. The files were lost or buried. The billboard came down, but the question never did. If the children were taken, raised under false names, and conditioned to forget who they were, then they didn't just lose their home. They lost their identity, their history, their parents, their truth. It's possible they lived full lives, never knowing their true names, never knowing that someone had once built a billboard with their faces on it, that someone had crossed the country for decades chasing shadows, that someone left a light on for them every night. And that's the part that breaks you, because even after all the evidence, all the science, all the theories, this is the question that still cuts deepest. What if they were out there and just didn't know they were missing? Or worse, what if they did and were never allowed to return? The fire went out before dawn, the smoke cleared, the house was gone, but something much darker remained, a mystery too sharp to ignore. What happened to the Sodder children? That question has outlived the investigators. It's outlived George and Jenny. It's outlived most of their children. And yet, nearly 8 decades later, it still burns. Because there's something about the Sodder case that feels personal, even if you never knew their names before today. The night of December 24, 1945, was supposed to be Christmas, but for the Sodder family, it became a story so strange, so layered, so deeply unsettling. It reads like a cold case engineered in fiction, and yet it was real as the cut phone line, as real as the missing bones, as real as the mailbox that one day in 1967 held a photo of a man with Louis Sodder's eyes and a chilling message scribbled on the back. And still, no answers, We live in a world now where crimes are solved through DNA swabs and satellite photos, where one Google search can tell you who someone's ancestors were 3 generations back, where security cameras are on every corner and phone records track our every step. And yet, even with all of that, the Sodder children were never found. Not in records, not in foster homes, not in cemeteries, not in databases, not in any of the places where truth normally hides. It's as if they were erased, and that's what makes this case so chilling, so unnatural. Because when people disappear, there are usually clues left behind, trails, timelines, something. But in this story, everything that could have led to closure was either destroyed, hidden, or just never there to begin with. You don't need to believe in conspiracy theories to know something was wrong. The fire didn't burn hot enough, the search was too short, and that's what makes this case so chilling, so unnatural. Because when people disappear, there are usually clues left behind, trails, timelines, something. But in this story, everything that could have led to closure was either destroyed, hidden, or just never there to begin with. You don't need to believe in conspiracy theories to know something was wrong. The fire didn't burn hot enough, the search was too short, the officials too certain, the remains too missing, the evidence too conveniently lost. And the leads? They weren't followed. Or worse, they were, and someone made sure we never heard what was found. Even the private investigator who was hired to trace the 1967 photo? Gone, never reported back, disappeared like the children themselves. And that photo? Still unexplained. Historians have tried to close the case. Skeptics have written it off as a mix of tragedy and trauma. But those explanations fall apart under pressure. The evidence doesn't fade. It grows louder. New experts keep returning to the same conclusion. The official story cannot be true. So if it wasn't a fire, then what was it? The theory that the children were kidnapped? Some have speculated that the Sodder family's outspoken political beliefs, particularly George's anti-Mussolini stance, might have earned them enemies. Others believe it was a local dispute taken to a terrifying extreme, but nothing was ever proven, and that's the most haunting part. The deeper you dig, the more this story refuses to break open. It's not just a cold case, it's a scar on a quiet West Virginia town, a scar on one family's legacy, a scar on every person who has ever lost someone and been told to stop asking why. Because that's what happened here. Again and again, the Sodders were told to move on, to let it go, that their grief was misdirected, that their hope was false. But they never did. Not George, not Jenny, not the surviving children, not even after decades of silence. Because when something doesn't make sense, you don't just get over it. And in that way, the Sodder story isn't just about 5 missing children. It's about the human refusal to accept a lie as truth, about the fire inside people who keep asking questions long after the world has stopped listening. Today, some of the Sodder descendants still search. They've tried matching old family photos with missing persons archives. They've uploaded DNA to ancestry databases. They've spoken with researchers, journalists, podcasters, and historians. They keep looking, and maybe one day, someone will find that last missing piece. A birth certificate, a match, a name, a journal, a truth too big to stay hidden forever. But until that moment comes, if it ever does, this case will remain exactly what it is. We may never know what happened that night in 1945, but one thing is certain, the Sodders didn't just lose their home, they lost their peace. And in its place, they built a legacy of relentless searching, one that still echoes through time. Today, their story is more than a mystery. It's a warning that not every answer comes when you want it, that not every truth is welcomed, and that sometimes the scariest part of a story is how close it comes to being forgotten. But not this one. If you like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe and click the video on screen for another interesting story.